So Vodafone isn't exactly the first company that comes to mind when you think of a premium smartphone manufacturer. But with the Smart Platinum 7, the UK carrier is making its first attempt at breaking the high-end smartphone market. At £300 and with some pretty neat features, this device stands a real chance of being a flagship killer. But can it live up to that name? To look at, the Vodafone Smart Platinum 7 is off to a good, if not great start. It doesn't have quite the same wow factor as other premium phones, but then neither does Google's Pixel, to be frank. What the Platinum 7 does have is a professional looking black finish and a nicely patterned reflective rear. It's understated, but it feels quite executive on the whole. The body is made entirely from metal and glass, it has thin bezels and no physical home button on the front. The device can be a little bit slippery when placed on some surfaces, but it feels very solid in the hand and has a decent amount of heft. Overall, the design is fairly by the numbers, but there are a few nice elements here that are worth mentioning. For one, there's a fingerprint sensor located around the back, just below the camera and at just the right height to reach easily with an index finger. Also pleasing are the two front-facing speakers and some very nicely textured buttons along the sides. I mean seriously, these are some super nice buttons, so if it's a comfy and stylish set of buttons you look for on your device, then this is the phone for you. Oh, and you'll also find one more button than usual here too, a dedicated camera button. So the only slight downside to the design is the fact that there's some separation between the different elements of the device. So for example, the speaker grills, the panel they're on is a slightly different texture compared to the surrounding area. It's not the end of the world by any means, but it means you don't have that premium unibody effect that a lot of the more expensive devices give you. Overall, there's still more good than bad here in terms of the looks of the device, but it might just be an acquired taste. So it's the same story with the screen. You get a surprisingly high-end panel, even if it's nothing we haven't seen before. It has a nice crisp 2K resolution, and it's an AMOLED at that. With that in mind, it's no surprise that it has great colour saturation, deep blacks that almost blend into the bezels, and decent brightness. At 5.5 inches, the screen is also more than large enough for the majority of productivity tasks, and to be considered a phablet. Look closely and you'll notice that the screen is actually very slightly curved too, which is interesting. It describes itself as being 2.5D, but it's not going to be giving Samsung any sleepless nights. It's more just that the screen doesn't quite sit flush, and to me, this actually contributes slightly to the less cohesive look of the phone. But points for trying. The phone performs pretty smoothly, which is largely due to the software rather than the hardware. Specs-wise, the Platinum 7 is slightly underpowered compared with even last generation flagships, but not so that you'd notice. Inside is an octa-core Snapdragon 652 processor, with 4 cores clocked at 1.8 GHz and the other 4 clocked at 1.2. Despite that, navigating around the home screen is seamless, launching apps is snappy, and those numbers should be beefy enough to handle most games and apps with no problem. More importantly, I haven't experienced any crashes or major stutters even. Multitasking is also super smooth, which is probably helped along by the welcome 3GB of RAM, and the relatively stock version of Android, more on that in a moment. If you want the top performing Android phone on the market, then this is not it. But for general use, you shouldn't have any problems, and actually, it's pretty slick. If you are interested in the numbers though, then you can check out the results from Geekbench, Antutu and 3D Mark here. Storage-wise, you'll get 32GB on board, but happily, Vodafone saw fit to provide space for a microSD card too. Another good choice, Vodafone. So we have an above average screen and average internals. What about the rest of the hardware? So that fingerprint sensor doesn't have any fancy tricks, you can't use it to swipe through photos in your gallery for instance, but what makes up for that is the hardware camera button. So you can use this of course to take photos, which is always convenient, or you can reprogram it to launch any of your favourite apps and perform other functions, so that's always handy. The other highlight in terms of the hardware is the inclusion of stereo speakers. These always make a big difference and this is no exception. The Vodafone Smart Platinum 7 is capable of immersing you in its sound and can be easily heard over the sound of a frying pan if you like to watch YouTube while you cook. The call quality is also exactly what you'd expect / hope, while the signal strength has been very reliable in my testing. Of course, the phone is locked to Vodafone, so you'll have to decide for yourself how you feel about that. For me, the longevity of the 3000 mAh battery is actually one of the stars of the show here, and it's one of the things that Vodafone is bragging about the most in its marketing. Those bragging rights are earned though, and the battery life here has put many of my recent phones to shame. At the end of a full day of moderate to heavy use, the Smart Platinum 7 will generally still have about 20% battery life. That's pretty impressive, especially considering it's running a Quad HD display. So if you're one of the people who's been bemoaning the lack of battery life in today's modern phones, then you might want to check out the Smart Platinum 7. The only thing they could potentially have done a bit better would be to include a replaceable battery, but you can't have everything, I suppose. And even better is the phone's impressive idle time. It can easily hold its charge overnight. And there's quick charging, so you can fill up quickly again when it finally does run out. The camera though lets things down slightly. The rear shooter has plenty of pixels at 16 megapixels, but the results just can't compete with the top players. There's an f2.0 aperture, but it does not perform well in low light settings. Depth of field effects are distinctly underwhelming, and autofocus seems to struggle in macro shots. Photos often look overexposed, and pictures will often feature cloudless white skies, even with HDR turned on. At times, the colours look washed out, though admittedly, I am a fan of a little hyperreal saturation. I'm not saying it's terrible. Under the right circumstances it will pick up a lot of detail, and the app is easy to use and nicely laid out. But coming from my Galaxy S6 Edge Plus, this is just a big step backwards. As for video, you can record at 2160p at 30fps or 1080p at 60fps. There's also a front-facing 8 megapixel camera capable of filming at 1080p.
What better place to test the camera than the Oxford camera? In the rain.
The Vodafone Smart Platinum 7 wins back some major points though with its software choices. Specifically, Vodafone should be applauded for opting to provide us with a pretty much stock version of Android Marshmallow. There's no ugly skin on top of the UI, and even the bloatware is surprisingly restrained. This no doubt helps performance a great deal, and Android purists are certain to be very pleased with the choice. It almost feels like using a Nexus device. So just how premium is Vodafone's top-end offering? Can it really replace a Galaxy or a HTC? Sadly, the answer has to be no. For those who really want the best Android experience, the slightly less future-proof processor is likely to be a turn-off. Everyday users, meanwhile, may find the camera a little lackluster for their taste. But for those looking for the closest thing to a flagship phone for a much lower price, this is a very strong contender indeed. There are no sexy gimmicks, but this is a very reliable phone that performs better than average in almost every capacity. So is this phone a flagship killer? It's close, but no cigar. It's a great flagship alternative though, and for the price, it's really pretty hard to fault. So thanks for watching guys, hope you found this video useful and interesting. If you did, then please consider liking and sharing, and maybe leaving a comment down below. Of course, remember to check out AndroidAuthority.com and stay tuned to the channel, for we are your source for all things Android.